The wind across Kansas carried dust like whispers of the past, scratching against the clapboard walls of Bitter Creek as the sun began its slow descent, casting a copper light over the half-built rail line that cut through the prairie like a scar. Out on the road, a man staggered, clutching a half-burned paper in one bloodied hand, his body bent with exhaustion and pain. Hoofbeats echoed behind him, steady and unrelenting, like a clock ticking down. He had once believed that law could be written in ink and upheld in the courtroom, but now he knew better. In Bitter Creek, law was nothing but a bargaining chip, and justice was paid for in blood. That man was Silas Garner, a Freedman's Bureau clerk turned deputy, a man who had tried to wear the star not for power but for conscience. He had seen enough war in his youth to know that violence carried debts that never stopped collecting. But when he came to Bitter Creek with his wife and their 2 children, he thought he had found a place to start anew. The war was nearly a decade behind, the land was harsh but fertile, and the town, though divided by race and old loyalties, was growing under the shadow of the great railroad that promised prosperity. For Silas, the badge was meant to mean something. That even a man without wealth or pedigree could stand on the side of the law. He would learn, however, that the star was not armor but a target. The trouble began with a cave-in. A rail tunnel, hurried through shale and limestone, collapsed on 20 men. The company called it an accident, and Ezra Caraway, the contractor running the project, assured everyone that the railroad would pay what compensation they could. But Silas, who was called to keep order at the site, saw the truth written in the rubble. Timbers too thin, bolts left unfastened, candles burning low where proper lanterns should have been. He knelt beside the broken bodies of men who had trusted their lives to the company's promise of safety, and saw the carelessness for what it was. Not accident, but negligence. At first, Silas thought he could bring this to light. He spoke with workers who whispered that Caraway had ordered them to rush the job, that safety costs were cut because every dollar saved meant a bonus paid. He collected testimony, careful to note each name, each detail, and he even secured a copy of the ledger where Caraway had signed off on reduced expenditures. But soon, men began to vanish. A witness named Callum, who had come forward to speak, was found dead in a saloon alley, throat slit. Another man, Jose Morales, disappeared altogether, his bunk empty one night and his pay left unclaimed. By the time Silas realized what was happening, fear had spread among the workers, and those who might have stood with him were silent. The town itself was divided. To some, Caraway was a ruthless but necessary man, the one bringing prosperity to Bitter Creek. Merchants thrived on the influx of railroad men, saloons filled with coin, and farmers dreamed of their crops reaching markets farther east. To others, particularly the widows and families of the dead, Caraway was a murderer shielded by contracts and bribes. Silas found himself caught between these 2 factions, mistrusted by many for being an outsider and a freedman with a badge, and hated by those who feared he would bring down the railroad and its promise of wealth. And if you're drawn in by this clash between law and survival, make sure you subscribe right now, because stories like this don't just live in dusty history books. They live in the choices ordinary people had to make when justice came at a deadly price. The warnings came first as whispers, then as threats. A note pinned to the schoolhouse door where his daughter Evelyn studied read simply, "Stop or burn." His barn was set alight one night, flames devouring hay and livestock alike, while neighbors watched from the dark, unwilling or afraid to lend a hand. His wife Martha begged him to walk away. "The law is written by them, Silas," she said, her voice raw with fear. "And when you fight them with their own law, they'll burn us out of house and home." But Silas's sense of duty was like iron, bent perhaps, scarred from the war, but not yet broken. He believed still that if he brought evidence before a judge, justice might prevail. Yet the more he fought, the more the law itself seemed to betray him. The courthouse ledger disappeared, stolen from the records office. Deputy Marshal Calloway, old and weary, warned Silas to be careful. "You're chasing ghosts, boy. Out here, the law ain't about truth, it's about who can pay to print it." Still, Silas pressed forward, and when he finally unearthed a burned but legible contract that bore Caraway's signature, proof that safety regulations had been ignored knowingly, he knew he had found his last chance. The railroad faced a deadline. If the line wasn't complete before winter, they would lose their federal subsidies. Caraway's desperation grew, and Silas's defiance became unbearable. One evening, as Silas walked home across the prairie, riders came upon him. They dragged him from his horse, beat him bloody, and left him to crawl back toward town, clutching the half-burned contract he had hidden away. That night, as Martha tended his wounds, he understood the full weight of his choice. If he presented the document at the public hearing, he risked not only his own life but the safety of his family. If he destroyed it, they could leave Bitter Creek behind with enough bribe money to start over somewhere far from Kansas. Survival or justice, there was no third road. If you were Silas, standing with your family's safety in one hand and the truth in the other, which would you choose? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is the kind of question that shaped lives on the frontier, and it's still the kind of dilemma that shapes us today. The day of the hearing dawned gray and heavy. Townsfolk crowded into the hall, the air thick with sweat and suspicion. Farmers stood beside rail agents, widows beside saloon keepers, all waiting to see which way the balance would tilt. Caraway arrived, flanked by hired guns, his polished boots striking the wooden floor like hammers. The judge, a man with cold eyes and fine clothes, called the hearing to order, his gavel echoing in the room. Silas rose, slow and stiff, his bruises still fresh, and placed the charred paper before the bench. He spoke plainly, recounting what he had seen, the testimonies he had gathered, and the evidence of Caraway's signature. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, anger rising, fear mounting. Caraway, his face hard, denied everything. But as Silas pressed, the contractor's mask slipped. In a moment of rage, Caraway shouted that the railroad's future mattered more than a few nameless laborers. He sneered that the judge himself had signed off on the rush orders, and in that instant, the town saw the corruption laid bare. The law, the very institution meant to deliver justice, was revealed as complicit. Chaos followed. Caraway's gunmen reached for their pistols, and in the echoing chamber of the hall, the sharp crack of gunfire split the air. Silas dove for cover, returning fire with the Colt he had carried since the war. Men screamed, benches splintered, and the town's future hung in the balance of each shot. When the smoke cleared, Caraway lay bleeding on the floor, a bullet through his chest, his eyes still burning with defiance. Silas stood over him, weapon trembling in his hand, knowing he had not won a victory, but carved out a reprieve. If you're still with me here, hit that like button. It lets me know you want more of these forgotten frontier tales, and it helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. The judge, his corruption exposed, slipped away into the night, and with him, the promise of any higher justice. The railroad would continue, its tracks pushing west, its profits secured by investors who would never know the names of the men buried under collapsed stone. Bitter Creek would grow, its saloons busier, its markets richer, but beneath the prosperity would lie the stain of blood and betrayal. For Silas, there was no triumph. He hung his badge on the door of the marshal's office and packed what little remained. With Martha and the children, he left Bitter Creek, riding eastward beneath a sky that seemed too wide, too indifferent. He carried no illusions now. The law was not a shield. Justice was not given freely. And the men who tried to hold those truths in their hands often found them burning hotter than iron. The story of Bitter Creek would pass into rumor and tale, told in hushed tones over whiskey glasses, twisted with each retelling. Some would say Silas was a hero who stood against corruption. Others would call him a fool who threw away security for principle. But the truth lived only in the dust, in the charred contract that crumbled to ash in his hands as they left town, and in the memory of the faces of the men who died for profit. And so the voice of history whispers. In towns like Bitter Creek, law was written by men with ledgers, enforced by men with guns, and carried by men like Silas Garner, who bore the weight of justice long after the dust had settled. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't just watch. Be part of this journey. Subscribe, share this story with someone who loves history, and let's keep these voices from the frontier alive.